Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Darris with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, here with Jeff Riddle with the Texas Workforce Commission. We're going to go ahead and get started here in about 5 minutes, so at 10:05, with our Reasonable Accommodations and Accessibility webinar. Just a couple items of housekeeping. If you have questions during the webinar, go ahead and put those into the questions box in the software. We will try to get to them when we get to a break in the presentation, or we may save it till the end, but we will get to pretty much all questions. We may have to get to you later after the webinar, do a little research, but we will get back to you with any answers. If you need a certificate today, make sure that you are logged into a computer using the email address that you registered for this webinar. We can't give out multiple certificates for 5 people watching on a single screen. The software just doesn't know who's there, and neither do I. So if you need that, go ahead and log on. There's an app for the phone that if you can't get to a computer, the phone should be able to have that for you. With that, I'm going to give everybody until about 10:05 to log in. I'm going to put up a quick poll here to get an idea of who we have, so we can maybe tailor the presentation to the audience. And so I'll put that up here in just a moment. And like I said, we'll get started at 10:05. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Darris with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Thanks to those of you who went ahead and answered the poll question. Looks like about 2/3 of us are compliance or management staff at a TDHCA monitored property, and the rest of you are split between state and local governments or some other nonprofit or advocacy organization. So normal audience for us. A couple of items of house cleaning. We are going to be taking questions today. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type that into the questions box. There's going to be about 250 people here by the end of the day, I guess. So hand raising is going to be not very useful. I've turned that feature off. So if you had a question, go ahead and type that into the questions box. If you are looking for the handouts, there is one handout. It is a copy of the slides, and you can find that in the materials section of the GoToWebinar software. It looks like a piece of paper with a paper clip attached to it, and you'll be able to find the slides there. And with that, oh yeah, one other thing, if you are looking for a certificate to prove that you attended the webinar, please make sure that you are separately logged into the webinar. If there's 4 or 5 of you on one screen, there's no way the software knows who's who. So if you need a certificate, make sure that you log in. You can do that on your phone as well, and it should still work for you. But with that, let's go ahead and we will get started. This material is based upon work supported by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Fair Housing Initiatives Program and a long grant number that I won't read out because it's not worth not worth the time. Any opinions or findings or conclusions that you have in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Today you're going to be hearing from 2 of us. You've already heard from me. My name is Nathan Darris. I'm the Fair Housing Coordinator at the Housing Resource Center here at TDHCA, and you have my contact information there available for you. And then with me is Jeff Riddle. Jeff, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, good morning. So again, my name is Jeff Riddle, and I'm the Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Civil Rights Division nested within the Texas Workforce Commission. And my contact info is also there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. So today we're going to be going over the Fair Housing Act, the Texas Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. We will also cover then specifically reasonable accommodations and modifications. We'll discuss some accessibility issues in design and construction, and then we will discuss complaints and mediation, or basically what happens if there's a complaint filed against you, or if you file a complaint. Just to give a little bit of context as to why we do have an entire webinar based on reasonable accommodations over any 5-year period, about 60% or more of all complaints filed in Texas that are fair housing complaints list disability as a protected class, and of those, a large chunk list reasonable accommodations or modifications as the reason for the complaint. So this is one of the probably one of, if not the largest issue that TWC sees. I think, Jeff, if that's incorrect, you can kind of correct me, but I think that this is still about 30 something percent of all complaints in Texas are reasonable accommodations.
I would almost say 60 to 70% of our complaints over any given month are disability, accessibility related issues or failures to accommodate.
Okay, great. So we're going to take some time here to look at the 4 different laws that cover reasonable accommodations and modifications in the state of Texas. The first of those is the Fair Housing Act, or the Fair Housing Amendments Act. This is really 2 different laws. The first of which was signed in 1960, passed in 1968, signed by Lyndon Johnson into law. It outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, color, and national origin. And I'm missing one. No, I'm not. Race, religion, color, and national origin. And then in 1988, the Fair Housing Amendments Act was passed. That added the protected classes of disability and familial status. to the Fair Housing Act. That law is enforced by HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and then also in Texas by the Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division and a handful of other FIPS that operate throughout the state, specifically in like the city of Austin, has its own enforcement office. The next law that we're going to talk about is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Section 504 was drafted in 1973 and took effect in May of 1977. It is the first federal civil rights protections for individuals with disabilities, stating that no otherwise qualified individual with handicaps in the United States shall, solely by reason of his or her handicap, be excluded from the participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. TDHCA also has some limited ability to enforce sections of Section 504 on properties that were awarded funds or tax credits after September of 2001. Section 504 has some pretty specific requirements. One is that any program or property that is subject to Section 504 is required to make and pay for any reasonable structural modifications to units or common areas if those changes are needed to afford a person with disabilities equal access or the ability to use and enjoy their dwelling. You also must operate housing that is not segregated based on disability unless it is otherwise strictly allowed via federal statute. There's a couple of programs that you may be familiar with, such as HOPWA or Section 811, that have this exemption. You also must provide auxiliary aids and services that are necessary for effective communication. You must also perform self-evaluation of your program and policies to ensure that you are not discriminating based on disability. You must also develop a transition plan to ensure that structural changes are properly implemented. You must operate programs in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of the qualified persons with disabilities. You need to provide newly constructed or rehabilitated housing that has a minimum of 5% of units, a 1% with a 1 unit minimum, accessible to persons with mobility impairments, and then an additional 2% with a 1 unit minimum be accessible for persons with hearing or vision impairments. So in a housing development with 100 units, 5 must have accessibility improvements already made for individuals with mobility impairments, and 2 must be accessible to people with hearing or vision impairments. If the development has, say, only 10 units, then those would be 1 accessible for individuals with mobility impairments and 1 for individuals with hearing or vision impairments, because it can never be less than 1 and it has to be a minimum of 5%. And then if you employ 15 or more people, you must delegate or designate at least 1 person to coordinate Section 504 compliance and to adopt grievance procedures that incorporate due process standards and provide for prompt and equitable resolution of complaints from applicants, either for employment or for housing and residence. Section 504 does also have some specific prohibitions. First, you cannot deny the opportunity to participate in a program, service, or activity due to a disability or anyone's disability. May not deny or refuse to rent housing to a person with a disability because of their disability. You can't impose tenant selection criteria, fees, or conditions that are different from those required of or provided to persons who do not have disabilities. You can't require persons who have a disability to live on specific floors or in certain areas of the community, or even require them to rent the already accessible units that we just talked about. You also cannot refuse to make repairs or limit access to public or common areas, parking privileges, services available to other residents, terms and conditions, anything like that. You also can't deny the person the opportunity to participate on advisory or planning boards. These requirements and prohibitions are applicable to all housing programs that receive HUD funding, actually any federal funding, so that would include USDA, except for mortgage insurance, loan guarantees, but it does include home investment partnerships programs and community development block grant programs. Section 504 also covers employees of federally assisted housing, as well as applicants and tenants. And Section 504 is what paved the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law on July 26, 1990. It provides protection against discrimination based on disability in many areas of life, and it is divided into 5 titles. Title 2 and 3 apply to fair housing. Title II covers non-discrimination on the basis of disability by public entities. Public entities means any state or local government, any department, agency, special purpose district, or other instrumentality of a state or local government. This would include public housing authorities, and also includes the National Railroad Passenger Corporation and any other commuter authority. Title III of the ADA covers public and common use areas at housing developments when those public areas are, by their nature, open to the general public or when they are made available to the general public. So, for example, it would cover the rental office or leasing office of an apartment complex, since because by its nature, the rental office is open to the general public. However, it might not necessarily extend to the pool if members of the general public are not allowed to use the pool. In addition, if a daycare center or community room is made available to the general public, it would be covered by Title III. And Title III would apply regardless of whether the public and common use areas are operated by a federally assisted provider or a private entity. If the community room or daycare center were open only to the residents of the building, then Title II would not apply. So basically, if the general public, not just somebody who rents in that apartment complex or owns a condo in that complex, if it is available to the public as a whole, then Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act would apply here. So one thing that's not necessarily a law, but it is a set of guidelines, and we will be discussing them a little bit further later on, is the HUD and Department of Justice memoranda on reasonable accommodations and modifications. HUD and the Department of Justice released these in 2004 and 2008, and both of these memoranda clarify questions regarding the implementation of the Fair Housing Act. Including clarification on the verification of a need for a reasonable accommodation or modification for an individual with a disability. And then finally, the Fair Housing Act. We did discuss this a little bit. The Fair Housing Act does prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, or disability in the United States. And it is the policy of the United States to provide fair housing throughout the United States so that no person is subject to discrimination because of their protected class or status. And this covers not just renting a home, selling a home, it also covers the advertising of housing in the use of brokerage services or in the availability of real estate related transactions. And then the Texas Fair Housing Act is the last of the laws that we will talk about. And that is basically almost word for word exactly the same as the Federal Fair Housing Act. It is just specific to Texas. So it is in a way redundant, but it does allow agencies like the Texas Workforce Commission the ability to also enforce fair housing laws in Texas or similar fair housing laws similar to the Fair Housing Act in Texas. And I'm going to hand this over to Jeff to talk about what a disability is.
All right. So, ahead and move along. If you were with us a week ago now, you would know that we went over all 7 of the protected categories: race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. Today, obviously, as we said, because of the nature of complaints received, we are going to be focusing on that disability protected category because that's where we normally see our reasonable accommodations and modifications. So, what is a disability? By definition, next slide, please. A disability is one of 3 things. It could be a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. a record of an impairment or be regarded as having an impairment. When we look at disabilities, those major life activities that impairment has to affect could be most of the things that you do in life. Hopefully, a lot of them you're doing right now: hearing, seeing, breathing, walking, talking, learning, even your body's ability to maintain its own internal bodily functions. And so, anything that significantly impairs any one of these type of activities is going to be seen as a disability. To put it, like in generalized terms, there's a lot of different types of common impairments that could be seen as a disability. Next slide. That could be visual, speech, or hearing impairments, or muscular dystrophy, heart disease, even alcoholism, as in a recovery type program, is we can get into. But as you see, some of these impairments, you can look at a person and probably know that that person in a wheelchair or with an assisted walking device has probably got a mobility impairment. You may look at a person and not be able to know that that person has a severe form of respiratory distress or asthma or cancer. We wouldn't know. So, a disability does not have to be obvious. It also doesn't have to always be outwardly affecting an individual for it to be. That's where that record of a disability comes into play, when we talked about those three. And then it's important to note that last one that was a couple slides ago, that being regarded as having an impairment is important as well. If a housing provider, in a generalized term, treats a tenant as if they are disabled and then treats them differently, even if they don't have that perceived disability, they are protected under the law. So, as a good rule of thumb, a way of avoiding even, to taking that last one of being regarded, is understanding that no housing provider can require any tenant or to disclose a disability for themselves or anybody living in that home or house, and no tenant has to disclose a disability. So in essence, if nobody can ask about a disability and nobody has to say anything, then everybody should be treated normally and equally, and we never assume anything. If we do that, then we will never run afoul of that being regarded as being impaired. Next slide. So now that we've understand what a disability is and who belongs to that protected category, obviously now our jumping point is getting into reasonable accommodations and modifications for specifically those individuals to have the equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. Next slide. So what does the acts, and again, the acts, both the federal and the Texas Fair Housing Act, because they're similar, what do they require? First and foremost, housing providers need to make reasonable accommodations or allow for a modification when such may be necessary for a person with a disability the equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. Key things in here. One, we'll get into the difference between providing an accommodation and allowing for a modification. But may be necessary is a very key part of what the law requires. May be necessary means that there has to be a correlation, a relationship. Nexus is what the official law says, but don't worry. Just think of it as a relationship between what the disability is and is affecting and what is being requested. What that means is having a disability doesn't allow a person to have anything that they want. It does have to be tied to what is being affected. For example, if I'm a former service member, I am living in a 5-story apartment complex in, I don't know, pick a random town, Nacogdoches, because I was just out in East Texas not too long ago. And it's a stairwell only unit. There's no elevators or anything like that. And after, a while of seeing my therapist at the VA finally was like, yeah, you know what? I think you need an emotional support animal for the betterment of your mental health, and provides me with, a note, a letter, which we'll cover in a minute, It says, here you go. And so, I take that to my apartment complex. And I'm like, yep, I have this animal. It is there for my mental health. Here's my doctor's note. That is my reasonable accommodation request. And now my pet turns into my emotional support animal. But again, I live on the fifth floor of this apartment complex, and my animal that is there for my mental health is a little 5 pound Pomeranian. It's a small thing. Um, and I say 5 pounds, it's probably closer to 5 ounces. But it's small. And, after about the second or third trip to go down to the bathroom of walking down 5 flights of stairs and up 5 flights of stairs, it just doesn't want to walk the stairs anymore. So I got to carry the dog. And so for the rest of the day, until our last bathroom break, I'm having to carry my little Pomeranian up and down these stairs. Now, remember, that dog is there to support my disability, and it is kind of becoming an inconvenience for me to carry it. And, we see the last couple of words on this slide, not only the use, but the enjoyment of a dwelling. I'm not getting a lot of enjoyment living on the fifth floor and carrying my dog up and down these stairs, and it's there for my disability. I'm going to request to move down to a lower floor as an accommodation. That is not what the law is there for, because there's no maybe necessary. There is no correlation between going up and down the stairs and the disability of the mental health thing for the dog. So it does have to be tied to what is being affected is what is being requested. And that's kind of the foundation for today's webinar. And what we're talking about is that is our foundation. But getting into what a reasonable accommodation is, next slide. Um, a Well, there are two types: reasonable accommodations and modifications, and we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. I'm going to kick off with reasonable accommodations. Next slide, please. So again, why do we grant the reasonable accommodations? And ultimately, there are a lot of times where because it's an adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service. And there's a lot of times where those policies could have a different effect on an individual with a disability. There's a barrier there. There is something to overcome. There is something that is making something inherently more difficult. And so by granting a reasonable accommodation, we are helping basically like leveling that playing field. We are removing those barriers to getting that equal use and enjoyment out of their home, house, apartment, the place where they reside. Next slide, please. So a reasonable accommodation specifically is going to be a change, exception, adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service. This is why I say, reasonable accommodations are provided for, because there is a policy or something in effect, and somebody is asking for a change to it, an exception for that. A lot of times, the most common reasonable accommodations that I specifically hear within the job, obviously, is the great topic of our assistance animals as an umbrella term. There's assistance animals. It could be parking spots. I get that one a lot too. If you're living in a first come, first serve parking spot, in say an apartment complex, somebody requesting a parking spot could be a reasonable accommodation because we are going to be exempting that maybe that tenant in the first come and maybe assigning a parking spot to them. And it could be anything. Changing out air filters. If I'm in a unit where I can't change out air filters and my severe asthma requires my air filters to be changed out or something along those lines. And so now we are adjusting the maintenance schedule for my specific air filter. But those are going to be provided for by a housing provider. And again, reasonable accommodations are a lot of different things. Those examples are just some very generalized ideas behind it. But again, it is going to be provided for usually by the housing provider. Next slide. It's very important to understand too when we do talk about reasonable accommodations that the setting of terms and conditions on that accommodation are probably going to be illegal. It is illegal to set specific terms and conditions on reasonable accommodation requests. For instance, we had a case a few years back now where a individual living in an apartment complex wanted to enjoy the use of the pool, but due to their disability, they could not be out in the sun for any kind of experienced periods of time with exposed skin to the direct sunlight. And who wants to swim in a pool looking like you're, in a blizzard conditions, fully clothed? So they requested to use the pool after the hours of 10 o'clock. And they had to request it because the gate to the pool was locked at 10 o'clock. We all know Texas summers. It does, the sun does stay out really late in the Texas summers. At first, that apartment complex denied that request, but then they relented and said, yes, okay, we're going to allow this. But because we're going to have this gate unlocked when our normal staff is not here, and our insurance policies, we're going to have to hire some additional security now because of insurance requirements. And they were going to offset the cost for that security with this person who's going to be using the pool. Not the full cost of additional security, but still they were going to increase this resident's rent because this resident was going to be using the pool and they're going to have to hire extra security. That's setting that a legal term and condition on a reasonable accommodation request. And a housing provider can't do that. Additionally, we shouldn't infringe upon the rights of other residences in order to, make a reasonable accommodation. For instance, again, another case, we had a college student who was living in one of the many college towns around the state. I won't say which one because people are really they like their specific areas. We're talking to all of Texas, I believe, right now. So, and I don't want to be like I knew it was that city, but young lady was living in one of those share, you have your own individual room, but you share common areas, kind of like the old boarding houses. And there were three rooms. Two of the occupants both had cats, and I mean, pet friendly, pet fees, pet deposits, all of that stuff. Everything was on the up and up. There was nothing uh, underhanded about it. A new person came in and inspected the third room, said yep, I'll take it, moved in, and within a month went to the apartment manager, was like, hey, like my allergies are really bad because my roommates have cats. Can we do something about that? And the apartment complex's accommodation was to tell the other two roommates who legally had cats, according to their lease agreements and everything else like that, and to get rid of their cats as an accommodation to this third roommate who was allergic to it. That can't happen either. You can't refuse or deny people their normal rights in a housing environment as an accommodation to this third individual. That third individual probably should have been moved to a unit that didn't have any animals living in it at the time, at the first available opportunity. So it is, we don't want to set all of those, illegal terms and conditions on reasonable accommodation requests. Even if there is insurance or something requirements, my insurance is going to raise because of X, Y, and Z of approving this. Then you're going to hear the answer probably somewhere, well, you might need to look at another insurance carrier over passing those additional costs on to residents. Next slide. And I will turn it over to Nathan to describe reasonable modifications.
Thanks, Jeff. So Jeff did just talk about reasonable accommodations, but if you remember a few slides back, there was also something called a reasonable modification. A reasonable modification, instead of being a change to a rule or a practice or a policy, a modification is a change to a physical structure itself that may be necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy their dwelling. So if a tenant has a disability, the Fair Housing Act requires that landlord to, or prohibits the landlord from refusing to let that person make a reasonable modification to the dwelling or common use area at that person's own expense. So not the property owners, but the person with the disability requesting the modification. at that person's expense if it is necessary or may be necessary for that person to use the housing. So an example of a modification here might be, if you see the picture, right, an individual with say a wheelchair needs to be able to get to the main office of the apartment complex, and there are steps but no ramp. They can request the right to install a ramp, although yeah, they can request the right to install a ramp to make it so they can get to and from the main office. Or if this were the front steps to their own townhome or their own first floor apartment, right? These are changes to the structure itself that would be useful or necessary for a person with a disability to be able to live at that complex or in that unit. So while these are rules for reasonable accommodation requests, these are also rules for reasonable modifications as well. If you, as a housing provider, um, get reasonable accommodation or modification requests, these are some rules that apply. One, always accept verbal requests. Modification or accommodation requests do not have to be written down. You cannot force them to be written down. If someone comes to your office and says, "Hey, I have a hard time going up and down stairs, uh, and you have first floor units available. Can I transfer to a first floor unit?" You don't need to make them write anything down. They don't have to come back to you with a specific form. That verbal request is enough to be considered a reasonable accommodation request. Um, Obviously, the request does need to be made in a manner that a reasonable person would understand to be an exception or change or adjustment uh, to a policy, rule, practice, or service because of a disability. So if someone just says, "Hey, I need my air conditioner fixed," there's no indication there that it has anything to do with the individual's disability. It's just that someone wants their air conditioner fixed. That's not a reasonable accommodation. But if somebody says, "I need my filters changed," as Jeff mentioned earlier, more often because of my severe asthma, there it is. You have an impairment to breathing and a request for a change to normal policies. Normally, you would do it every 6 months. You need it every month. There's a change to a policy, and there's a clear disability-related need. That is a reasonable accommodation request, even if the person didn't use any magic words like reasonable accommodation or even the word disability. None of those words are necessary as long as those required items are in there. The existence of a disability, the and a change in policy or procedure, and the nexus between those. When you have or provided a request for a reasonable accommodation or modification, you should immediately begin what we call the interactive process. So, it's not, this is not so much a rule across the board as it is best practice, unless you're a TDHCA monitored property. We'll get to that in a second. Um, but it's always good policy to not just take someone's request at face value. Ask clarifying questions if necessary. Just because someone says that they need to change their shower or tub to a roll-in shower doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that would make their housing usable and enjoyable to that person. Sometimes they may simply need assistance in transiting between a wheelchair and a tub, in which case the addition of some grab bars may be sufficient. It may be sufficient to have a chair or bench placed in the tub to make it easier to transit in and out or to sit while bathing. So always begin that interactive process to find out what the need is and if there are alternative accommodations or modifications that may suffice, particularly in cases where the modification being requested is particularly expensive or particularly disruptive to grant. Make sure you're always carefully drafting and reviewing your policies on reasonable accommodations and modifications on a regular basis. Annual might be great. Um, if it happens to happen more often than that, has to happen more often than that too. But basically, anytime you have an odd situation that your policies didn't cover or weren't clear on, that's a good time to then go and make sure that your policies are clear and make those edits as necessary. If a person comes to you with a reasonable accommodation request and the disability is not obvious or the need for the accommodation is not obvious, it is appropriate to ask for reliable disability related information to verify the need. You can However, there are some things that you cannot ask for. One, housing providers cannot ask for detailed medical records or access to those medical records. You can't ask for a specific diagnosis, but you do have the right to ask the requester to provide documentation that determines if the requester meets the definition of the Fair Housing Act, definition of a disability, and that describes the need for the accommodation, shows that relationship or that nexus between the person's disability and the need for the requested accommodation. What is a reliable third party? A reliable third party is a doctor or other medical professional, a peer group, or even a non medical service agency, or a third party who is in a position to know about the individual's disability and disability related needs may also provide that verification of a disability. Rarely, that may be a family member, though that is often not the case. For more information on that, you can always ask us more questions, or you can see the HUD Department of Justice Memorandum on Reasonable Accommodations, questions 17 and 18. Um, Also, when you have a request for reasonable accommodation, make sure that you provide prompt responses to reasonable accommodation requests. There is no hard time limit. But 14 days is generally considered a good time frame in order for you to provide a response to a reasonable accommodation request. And then number 6, finally, and this one is super important, document your actions and interactions. So if someone comes to you with a request for a reasonable accommodation or modification, write that down in the tenant file. Make note of it so that you have documentation of when the request was made, what the specific request was, and all of that. Even if the person asked verbally, it's a good idea to then, in the tenant file, write down the relevant information. Um, if you are the person requesting an accommodation, it is also a good idea to document your requests and responses. That way, you have a paper trail to show when you requested something and what it was that you requested, so that if a complaint does go to the Workforce Commission, you have all of your ducks in a row and all of your documentation there. Now, TDHCA has some very specific rules when it comes to reasonable accommodations and modifications. One, while we said that 14 days is a good guideline for timeliness of a response, 14 days is the rule if you are a TDHCA monitored property. So if you received federal funds through TDHCA or received low income housing tax credits through TDHCA. Not only that, your response has to take one of 4 forms. You must either grant the request, deny the request additional clarification on the request, or begin the interactive process, which is why that interactive process part on that last slide was so important. Because any undue delay in responding to a reasonable accommodation request can be considered a failure to provide a reasonable accommodation in these circumstances if you're a TDHCA monitored property. All right, so when you are asking about someone's disability, there's some important things to know. One, you may not ask any additional questions or request further verification if the disability related need and the disability are readily apparent. So if someone walks in with, say, a seeing eye dog and a red tipped cane, and they are asking for the ability to transfer to a unit that has visual and auditory smoke detectors, you have a readily apparent disability and you have a readily apparent disability related need. You do not have any right to ask any more questions or for request any further verification or documentation of either the disability or disability related need. If the disability is apparent, but the related need is not apparent or previously known, you may only ask for verification of the disability related need, not verification of the disability. When neither of those things are readily apparent, then you may ask for verification of the disability and disability related need for the accommodation. What inquiries can you make if a resident asks? Again, right, a housing provider may ask for information that is relevant to determining if a requested reasonable accommodation is necessary because of a disability, or for a disability that is not obvious or the need is not obvious, request reliable disability related information that shows that is enough to necessarily verify that the person meets the Fair Housing Act definition of a disability, describes the needed accommodation, and shows that nexus, that relationship between the disability and what is being requested. And again, we talked about this. What is reliable documentation? That is from a medical professional, peer support group, a non-medical service agency, or other reliable third party who is in a position to know about the individual's disability and disability-related needs that may provide verification of that disability. Jeff, do you want
Hey,
to pick up
Nathan,
here? Yeah.
can you go back? I'm going to touch upon the documentation just a little bit more, that maybe head off some questions.
Mhm.
So, as Nathan was talking about documentation, I mean, obviously, everybody, trust but verify. So, yeah, I mean, you got this, but we're going to need some documentation for whatever request. Moving down to the first floor, getting that animal, having your air filters removed, getting that parking spot potentially. So we're going to ask for that letter. And it's very important that you see the three things that are required on, and I'm colloquially using doctor's note, but it can be, again, anybody in that professional sphere. It may not come from a doctor, MD, it could come from a nurse case manager or a peer support group, as you see. But that doctor's note, it needs to say three things: that a person meets the Act's definition and has a disability, it describes the needed accommodation, and that will hopefully show that relationship, that nexus between the disability and the disability related need. What you don't see here on this slide is geographical areas, timelines. Those are not part of the law. The letter doesn't have to be dated within the last 2 weeks, 6 months, within the last year. That letter could be 5 years old from their doctor. It could come from a different city. You could be sitting in the city of Dallas, and the letter is coming from a doctor or a therapist in El Paso. And I say that because it's very important to think about those kind of aspects. One, um, since that year that we don't talk about a couple of years back, telehealth and telemedicine have become, really big in the medical world. Uh, I can sit down with my therapist who decided to move to Colorado Springs because they were tired of the extended summers in Texas. But that therapist gets me, so I'm going to continue to see them. So we meet on Zoom every month or so to talk about my issues. So it may not come in that same geographical area. It could come from somewhere else. Same with timelines. Disabilities don't just magically go away or usually get better unless they're of a temporary variety, like breaking a leg or recovering from surgery. But when we talk about those ones that usually affecting us, somebody's just not magically going to recover from asthma or blindness or a mobility impairment. So when there's that diagnosis and that person gets the letter, that's part of the treatment. Like if I went to the eye doctor because I was having trouble seeing, and they're like, "Yep, your eyes are bad. Here's the glasses you need to get." I probably never go back to my optometrist to make sure my eyes are still not working the way that they haven't been working in the past because I found the thing that fixes them. Same thing goes here in a lot of situations. If we find something that works, a person probably gets that letter, provides it, and so, then I'm shopping for a new apartment. It's been 2 years since I've got this. It was good in my old complex, good in my new complex. And they're like, nope, we can't accept this because your letter is 2 years out of date. A housing provider can request an updated letter, but they can't require that updated letter because timelines, again, are not part of what is required for a note. This is really big because there's a lot of times where we get this question. Happens more so than a lot of the other matters that we're talking about, that verification. Even just maybe as a year ago, Nathan had reached out to me because he's like, hey, Jeff, just curious. Somebody sent me these 3 different reasonable accommodation doctor's notes. And they were 3 different doctor's notes from 3 different housing providers, 3 different residences, but they all look the same. And they're like, I'm not sure. Here's the thing. Letters are probably going to look the same. And I will tell you the reason why. That is because nobody likes to reinvent the wheel. I am in a doctor's office. I'm the front office secretary, nurse case manager, whomever, and the doctor's like, "Hey, type up this letter for Mr. Jeff about his asthma and getting his air filters changed out," and I'll sign it. I don't know what to put on here, so I'm going to Google it. Hey, I need an accommodation letter for housing for this, and Google's going to tell me. ChatGPT is going to tell me. HUD's website has examples of reasonable accommodation letters. So letters are probably absolutely going to look the same because nobody is trying to figure out what to say. We're going to research what to say, and that's why letters can look the same. And a letter could be just simply as this. Mr. Riddle has a severe form of asthma and as such needs his air filters changed out every 30 days instead of the regular maintenance schedule. It's like 4 sentences. And that's a reasonable accommodation letter because it describes everything that was needed in that doctor's note. It doesn't have to go into symptoms. It doesn't have to go into specific diagnoses. There's case law where it was a letter just said this person has a mental health disorder. It didn't say the type, and it was granted because it just said there was a mental health disorder. It doesn't have to go into specific medical diagnoses. So, a lot of times, because again, we're going to trust but verify. And so, yeah, there's somebody comes up, I'm going to need documentation because most times you're not going to know that tenant has a disability and you're not going to know what they need. So, I just wanted to, kind of flesh that out before we potentially get some questions for that. Even if we do, we'll still answer them as we go along. But I will continue from here, though. Next slide. So, can you deny a reasonable accommodation request? Absolutely. Reasonable accommodation requests can be denied under one of 3 general circumstances, and that is that person poses a direct threat to themselves or other residences. Most of the time, this one takes in effect of the including service animals is more of the reason for denying is because the service animal is dangerous. But I caution people to make sure that it is a direct threat, not an implied threat. I know people who would be like, yeah, we're not going, even if it's your service animal, we're not going to, allow that chow to be here because I've been bitten by a chow in the past, and I don't like chows. I think they're dangerous and vicious breeds. Same with that, um, Malamute or any of them other type of dog breeds, Dobermans or some, pit bulls. We don't allow them, no matter what, even as a reasonable accommodation, because they are on our dangerous breed list. That is an implied threat. It is not a direct threat. A direct threat, there does have to be an issue going on. That animal is, maybe not like it's biting other, hopefully we could stop before it bites other people, but like it is acting in aggressive manners. There are other residents worried about their health and safety because of a specific incident, not because, well, that dog is dangerous, I just don't like the way it looks. That is implied. So it does have to be the direct threat. There's no disability related need for the accommodation. This one, I covered when we started talking about this means there has to be that relationship between the disability and what is being affected by that disability to what is being requested. If there is no relationship between those two, then yes, we can deny it because we are going to be basing it off of what is being affected, not again because you have a disability, you can get anything you request. So it does have to be tied to that. And then lastly, if the accommodation is not reasonable. Specifically, what that means, next slide, a unreasonable request is going to be a financial and administrative burden that would constitute a fundamental alteration to that housing provider. There is no line in the sand that when I cross this dollar amount or this much work that needs to be done, I need to move 5 residences, 5 different people to accommodate for this person's request in moving to an accessible unit. And that's a massive undertaking. There is no specific line in the sand that when you cross that amount of work, when you cross that dollar amount, it becomes unreasonable. The reason being is each request and each situation and each tenant is going to be different. It is a case by case basis. But if it is going to be something, Mr. Jeff, who's living on the 5th floor, whose dog doesn't, or he's having trouble navigating the stairs, and I don't have any first floor units open, he's requesting an elevator. I can't put in an elevator. It'd be like a Tiger King situation. I wouldn't financially recover from that. And so, I'm going to tell him that. Maybe that is if you wouldn't financially recover, you wouldn't be able to maintain the operating cost of it because of a reasonable accommodation request. That could be there. Same thing with again that the administrative stuff, moving residences, and adjusting leases or terminating leases, and all of that. It could be. But the biggest thing I'm going to tell you when it comes to this one is yes, a tenant might come up and be like, we are living in this 2-story apartment complex. I'm on the 2nd floor. I do have a mobility impairment, and I'm requesting an elevator because I saw it on TikTok, and I think it's just the thing that I need because I really don't feel like moving and I want an elevator. I cannot afford to put in an elevator into this complex. It is just not anywhere in my budget. I honestly probably have to sell if I try to do this. So I'm going to say no. Key thing here is there's, like as Nathan talked about, that interactive process. A lot of times our complaints boil down to 2 people talking at one another and not talking with one another. If like no, like yeah, I want an elevator. I can't do that. Here, let's explore some other options. I have a tenant, moving out of the 1st floor in, like the next 2 months, and I can move you down to that unit as soon as it's available as an accommodation request, and we can figure out some things to do in the interim between now and then to help your situation. If that housing provider is trying to work on those things and not just saying no, I can't do that, sorry, you're going to have to figure it out or go find somewhere else to live, that's going to be a failure to accommodate. But if that housing provider is working with that tenant to try to find that middle ground, then a lot of times you're not going to get into that position where you're getting into that failure to accommodate because we are trying to find a solution. And again, this works for both parties of that interactive process and talk with one another, not at one another. Next slide. So I'm going to kick. Well,
Yeah, this is a
yeah.
good time for me to pick it up. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. This one's more heavier on your side.
yeah. So we're going to talk about a couple of exceptions to responsibility and modification. So just a really quick recap before I move to the next slide. If you are a property that does not receive any federal funds, has not received any low income housing tax credits, remember you are only required to allow a modification to the structure. You are not required to pay for it. However, If you are a TDHCA monitored property, that is, you have received federal funds for your property, or you received tax credits after 2001, you are subject to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And if you remember from earlier on, that means you are responsible for paying for the reasonable modification, not just allowing it. So, as Jeff mentioned, there are times when you can also deny an accommodation. He said when the accommodation is not reasonable. This is also true of modifications. So if the modification would be an undue financial and administrative burden or would constitute a fundamental alteration of your operations, so the nature of the services that you provide, then you can deny a modification. And that is going to be true whether or not you are subject to Section 504 or not. But some of the things that you would need to take into consideration if you are, let's start with for everybody. If, for example, a modification would require moving or otherwise altering a load-bearing wall, that would be something that constitutes a fundamental alteration of the unit. That is a time when you can deny that specific modification, but again, you'll want to move over to the uh, the uh, interactive process at that point to see if there are other alternative accommodations that may or modifications that may work. If you are a TDHCA monitored property and you are denying an accommodation or a modification because it is a financial and administrative burden, these are the things that you're going to need to consider. One, the financial resources that you have. TDHCA will also look at this. We are going to look at the financials for your property and look at what the cash flow looks like at the property. That is going to speak to whether or not the accommodation or modification is too expensive. Also, the cost of the reasonable modification itself. Make sure that you get reliable estimates. I would recommend three estimates for what the cost will be so that you have documentation of what it's going to cost. You also need to consider what the benefits to the requester are for that requested modification. If they're going to be substantial benefits to the requester, that can alter the calculation. Um, and then also, are there other less expensive alternative accommodations or modifications that would effectively meet the disability related needs of the requester? This is the interactive process. This is how you will find those things. So always be discussing this with the requester saying, okay, so this is what you're asking for. What specifically are the needs that you have? And let's find some other ways that we can uh, maybe go about this while we're getting our bids. Say, hey, we got to get bids. In the time that we're getting bids here for the work, let's see if we can't identify some other alternatives because it'll also keep you from being having to be out of the unit while major modifications are being done. So always be hitting that interactive process. Um, so in determining who pays for a reasonable modification, there are a couple other little tweaks here. So in general, if you are not monitored by TDHCA in any way, shape, or form, you are not going to be responsible for the modification unless the when you built that building or when that unit was constructed, it was not constructed according to the not current like now, but what would have been current when built, design and construction requirements. So if there is something missing that should have been there and that's what's being requested as the modification, you're going to be responsible as the housing owner to pay for that modification because you're bringing it up to what it was supposed to already be. Um, if you receive federal financial assistance, um, if you received low income housing tax credits after 2001, if, for example, the accessibility feature is something that you're going to end up wanting to keep because it is that useful, you may consider paying for it at that point. or if for some other reason you've agreed to pay for a modification, then you are going to also you will be paying for that modification if you agreed to it. Um, Under Section 504, um, there are a couple of things. One, Jeff brought up the example of a an elevator, and in Section 504, right, it might feel like if someone has a disability related need for an elevator and your property doesn't have elevators, wasn't built with elevators, am I going to be responsible for paying for an elevator? No. And under TDHCA's rules, that is not going to ever be something that we will require you to do unless it's something that it was supposed to be there during design and construction. So if there are elevators there that aren't functioning, we're going to make you get them functioning. But if there were never elevators there, there were never supposed to be elevators there, we're not going to consider installation of new uh, elevators to be reasonable. Um, that's basically that's the biggest exception that we really talk about in terms of where you will never be responsible for paying for a modification if you're under Section 504. Once again, just to clarify, this is all in our rules in TENTAC, which is Texas Administrative Code. So Title 10, Part 1 of Texas Administrative Code, Rule 1.204. This is a very important rule. Be familiar with it if you are monitored by TDHCA, because that is going to be where all of these exceptions live, is in that rule. There is a chart here, but we've basically gone over it, and you'll notice if you look at the bottom right, if you have federal funds or if you have low-income housing tax credits awarded after 2001, then you're going to be paying. Otherwise, it's very unlikely that you're going to be paying unless it was a failure of design and construction requirements, or if you, for some other reason, agree to pay for a modification. What are all of these design and construction requirements? Well, we do not have time to cover all of them. There are, you know, 5 to 8 hour trainings that do nothing but talk about the Fair Housing Act Design and Construction Manual and other design and construction requirements. But generally speaking, if your building was constructed after March 1991, this Fair Housing Act Design and Construction Manual is going to tell you what is going to be necessary in the design to make it accessible and usable. But in general, that's going to be things like making sure there are accessible building entrances and accessible routes into and through dwellings and to and from exits. Accessible public and common use areas. Making sure that doors and windows, or sorry, that doors allow wheelchair passage within all rooms. That generally means at least 36 inches wide in a hallway in most cases. An accessible route into and through each unit. So not just from the unit to the amenities or unit to the exit, but within the unit, I have to be able to get to every room. Um, how high or low switches and outlets and thermostats are to be located on a wall. Generally speaking, the very highest point or very highest button, so functional part of a thermostat can't be any higher than 48 inches. Same with the switch, can't be higher than 48 inches. Um, Outlets can't be lower than 15 inches so that it's easy to reach the outlets from a seated position. It's going to require reinforcement in bathroom walls so that grab bars can be added as needed. While the grab bars may not necessarily have to be there, they do have to have reinforcement so that they can be added later at a later date if necessary. Also, usable kitchens and bathrooms that accommodate a person using a wheelchair. There are entire sections of the design and construction requirements related to what makes a type A bathroom versus a type B bathroom, and what mix of type A and B bathrooms is acceptable in a unit. So If you are someone who deals with the design and construction of buildings, I strongly recommend you find a copy of the design and construction requirements. We can get it to you. It is huge, and it is very low quality. It is not even, as far as I know, in print still, but we do have copies that we can get to you electronically speaking. They won't be great quality, but you'll have them. So let's talk about a couple of examples for TDHCA monitored properties. So these are all going to be TDHCA monitored properties that have low-income housing tax credits after 2001 or some sort of federal funding. If a resident came to you to request um, uh, transfer to a different property that has only ground floor units and townhomes. And this transfer is obviously to help alleviate the effects from a mobility impairment, right? Somebody who doesn't have the ability to easily go up and down stairs, a townhome would have stairs. Um, what are some proper responses to this request? Well, number one, if you own that other property, facilitating a transfer is certainly an acceptable opportunity or acceptable option. If you do not have a relationship with that other property, can't guarantee that that person could get into the other property immediately. You can, offer the ability to um, break the lease when they finally are able to effectuate that transfer without any penalties or fees, right? So no early termination fees in that particular case. Similarly, a tenant from the previous example also has a new van that's specifically designed to accommodate their wheelchair, and they ask you for um, an accommodation or a change to your current parking policy. Right now, you have first come first serve parking. None of it is assigned out to anybody, and they ask you to assign them a spot that is wide enough to fit their van and ramp. What are some reasonable options here? Or what are some acceptable responses here? One is going to be to go ahead and just accept that request. Parking is identified in the HUD and Department of Justice memoranda on reasonable accommodations as something that is almost always going to be yes, just do it, and that includes putting up signage to uh, uh, restrict others from using that parking spot, if necessary, repainting any lines to make it wide enough for the van and ramp. Also making any physical curb cuts that make it so that the individual can get from that parking space onto the sidewalk. That's generally going to be the only acceptable response here, unless you have other spots that are available that are already wide enough and already have those curb cuts. You can offer that as an alternative. It doesn't mean they have to accept that, but it is an alternative that you can offer. I think we've kind of covered this example before, but if a resident needed a ramped entrance to their ground floor unit, and that person doesn't want to move to a different unit, you as a recipient of federal funds or tax credits do need to provide an accessible entrance to that resident's current unit, unless, as we said, it would be an undue financial and administrative burden. That would be if there are weird site features that would make it impossible. Also, those usually need to be identified in the land use restriction agreement or in the application for tax credits, right? These are things that would be noted already um, in most cases. And then the one really expensive modification that we see quite a bit, and we see quite a few issues where properties do not want to grant this modification, right, is the changing of a tub to a roll-in or walk-in shower. If you are a Section 504 property or TDHCA monitored property, and making this modification would require moving existing plumbing or electrical, or would require altering a load-bearing wall. That is a time when you can deny that particular modification, but again, be thinking about alternative accommodations, be discussing with the individual alternative modifications that may help. Talk about transfer bars, talk about a bench to make it easier for them to get in and out of the existing tub. is there a different design? It may not necessarily be roll-in, but maybe a very low-lipped shower or tub might be feasible and might not require moving any load-bearing walls. So look for those options. Jeff, do you want to cover complaints?
I would love to. Next slide. All right. So, uh, with us, with the Civil Rights Division, again, if as long as you are not in one of those cities that has their own jurisdiction, City of Austin, City of Dallas, City of Garland, if you're not there, you can come to us with a fair housing complaint. Um, and when we get a fair housing complaint, if you are a provider, which I think the majority of our people in today's webinar was, you will be notified of an allegation, and you'll be invited to. It says mediate. I think the correct word for our fair housing is conciliation over mediation. And the reason why that is because throughout the entire process of our complaint. Um, there are multiple times where our investigators are trying to facilitate that discussion that might not have occurred between the housing provider and the tenant to seek a resolution of that issue before the complaint finishes, and then court proceedings and everything like that happen. So, if there is a complaint, there's going to be multiple touch points throughout the course of one of our investigations to try to find that common ground that is helped out with the use of one of our investigators. But if you do need to make a complaint, next slide, you can do that through our website. It is the easiest thing. Um, Phone numbers and 800 numbers and fax machines and all of that. Emails that might end up in a spam folder because of protocols or whatever is not, they're there, but they're not the primary way. The best way of reaching out to us if you do need to file a fair housing complaint is to go to the website twc.texas.gov. The best way of doing it is just search fair housing or housing complaint in the search bar instead of trying to figure out exactly where our landing page is because there's a lot of options to get there. Just search, and then you'll be on our housing page, and it lists all the basic rights and remedies, and then there's a section where if a person needs to file a complaint, they click on the link, they fill out all their information, what is going on, who they are, where they live, so on and so forth, and one of our housing intake specialists will reach out to them. I'm going to probably guess within 3 to 5 business days, but I always say 7 to 10 just to give them a little bit of leeway in case it might be a busy week for them. But it's really simple and easy, and our website is mobile friendly, so you can do it from your phone because not everybody has access to a computer, but we all have usually access to phones and devices. Next slide.
And if you are in a TDHCA monitored property, you can also file a complaint with TDHCA. Along with filing that complaint with Texas Workforce Commission. TWC enforces the Fair Housing Act, whereas TDHCA, we enforce our section of Texas Administrative Code. So we saw that Texas Administrative Code 10-TAC 1.204. That's our rules on reasonable accommodations. We also have some limited ability to enforce Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So if you are at a TDHCA monitored property and it's a reasonable accommodation issue, you can file that complaint with us. If your complaint is about discrimination not based on disability or based on Violence Against Women Act protections, we will not be able to assist you. We can only deal with Violence Against Women Act and reasonable accommodation or modification complaints. Um, any other kind of discrimination based on like race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, those would need to go to the Texas Workforce Commission or to your local enforcement agency, like in the city of Austin. The city of Austin has its own office. If you need any additional training or technical assistance, you can contact us. This is our contact information. I'm going to go ahead and leave that up while we go ahead and move over to questions. So if we have questions, go ahead and start putting those in the box. We can in the questions box. We can answer them as they come in while we wait for people to do that. Just a reminder that next week on the 29th, same time, 10 a.m., we will be having our final fair housing webinar of the series, which is going to be on emotional support or assistance animals in general. So, if you had questions about assistance animals, that's going to be a place where you might get the answers. So definitely recommend anybody who has any questions about assistance animals coming to that webinar. I am not seeing any questions coming in. Ah, so we did have a question. TDHCA only takes complaints for reasonable accommodations and modifications. No, no, no. Okay, sorry. I want to clarify what I mean. As far as a fair housing issue goes, that's the only place where we have any jurisdiction. We have lots of other rules about rent limits, about notification of non termination or non-renewal, right? Those are separate from fair housing, right? And those still come to us. We handled plenty of those complaints on a regular basis. So no, TDHCA doesn't only handle complaints about reasonable modifications and accommodations, but in terms of fair housing, in terms of discrimination complaints, that's the only place where we have any jurisdiction. As far as a reasonable accommodation for accessible parking, we can't put an HC label. We have to install a reserved parking sign, correct? Because otherwise, if it's labeled handicap parking, anyone can park there. Yeah, this is a super good question, and the answer is you are very much correct. So if you assign an already striped and signed out handicap parking spot, yeah, that's going to take away from whatever your local minimum is. So once you stripe the pavement and put the handicap sign on a parking spot, it is available to the public, not even just to tenants in general, but to the public as a whole. It is available to them. So if you are going to reserve a parking spot, and one of your already handicapped parking spots, and reserve that for a tenant, you're going to need to make sure that you're not below your minimum requirements. So most cities have a minimum handicap parking requirement based on how many units or the square footage, something like that. Make sure that you're still hitting that minimum, or when you're in that interactive process, right, with the individual, say like, hey, is it that specific spot that you need, or do you just need a close spot that's wide enough um, and reserved? You may not have to give them one of the handicap spots specifically, but you're going to need to still reserve a spot for them. But you can figure out what spot will work with that person um, in that interactive process. Do we have to have a designated amount of handicap spots available? Consult your local ordinances. As far as I know, TDHCA, we do not have any. We do not have any minimum requirements. Cities, counties, they may have some. Um, as far as I know, I don't think the state of Texas sets any hard minimums in property code, but I'm not an attorney and I can't give you legal advice. So go look that up yourself, but I don't believe it to be the case. Um, so any spot that is painted for handicap must remain a handicap. Again, how do we find out the minimum number of handicap spots? Consult your local municipality, so your city, your county. That's going to be where that answer is. What do I think about the request for a carpet removal due to dermatitis? I think if there is a disability related need, so if that dermatitis is uh, a substantial limitation to a major life activity, so it could be like just constant itching is going to keep you from being able to care for yourself, eat. A lot of times that's also going to accompany breathing issues. If there is a substantial limitation to a major life activity, then if the removal of that carpet removes that trigger of dermatitis, that's going to be something that would be a reasonable modification. If you're a TDHCA monitored property, you're going to need to remove that carpet at your own expense. If you're not a TDHCA monitored property, you can allow the tenant to remove the carpet and replace it with flooring, but you're not going to be paying for it. Um, I already know of at least several examples where a TDHCA monitored property had to do this for one reason or another. Dermatitis isn't the only reason. A lot of times, individuals in motorized wheelchairs have a difficult time going over high pile carpeting, and will need it removed. Fairly common to have that happen as well. So that's not even the only reason why carpet removal may happen as a disability related for a disability related need. Let's see. There was another question here. Yes. A tenant is requesting a taller toilet. Would that be a reasonable accommodation, and who would pay for it? Again, first question to ask, if you are worried about who is paying for it, do you have federal funds on the property? Were you awarded tax credits after 2001? If the answer to either of those is yes, you, the property owner, are paying for it. Or if you are a property management company and you're the designee of the owner for handling these items, right? But the tenant is not going to be the one responsible for paying for that modification. If, however, you do not have federal funds, you do not have tax credits after 2001, then you have to allow the tenant uh, to have that raised toilet, but you don't have to pay for that modification itself. This is another really, really good time to talk about the interactive process. Sometimes someone will say, I need a taller toilet, but what they really need is just the seat to be higher. They do have risers for toilet seats that can raise them up 1, 2, 3, 4 inches to make it easier for someone to sit on. You may not need to replace the whole toilet. So bring that up as an option. Um, Aaron, you have asked a question. Is there a front desk that provides direct ASL communication or any deaf staff in your services? Um, can you go ahead and email me? I'm not totally certain I understand. TDHCA, we don't really have any we don't have any in-person meetings with the public as a whole usually outside of like our board meetings. We don't generally take one-on-one meetings, so the we don't have ASL communication right at a front desk or anything like that. But if there is an individual who needs um, any kind of ASL interpretation, just like we did for this webinar, as long as we are aware of that as a need beforehand, generally we need about 48 hours to be able to procure the services. We are able to meet with that individual. That we can also do that with someone who is not English language proficient. We have the ability to get on live um, translation from like a huge list of languages. So if there's something specific, Aaron, go ahead and email me, and we can figure out the specifics that way. Um, if awarded those tax credits after 2001, but those are no longer in effect, does that end where you are liable for the cost? If you are still in your compliance period or extended use period, and you received tax credits after 2001, yes. Honestly, I don't know how, unless you received tax credits and then had a qualified contract that got you out of the compliance period. I don't know how you would have gotten tax credits after 2001 and not still be in our compliance period. Usually those last about 30 years. So, Erica, you had that's a very specific question. We may need to look at the very specific at that property specifically to see if there was, say, a qualified contract, or if you're no longer in the extended use period. But if you are in your extended use period or your 15-year compliance period, um, you're still required, even if you're not claiming those 10 years of tax credits, you still are going to be required to be, you're still Section 504, um, covered by Section 504. Um, Even if you receive federal funding, for example, TDHCA, if you can't afford the modification, you can say no to the modification. Yes, if you cannot afford the modification. Now, if you are monitored by TDHCA, know that you're not just going to be able to say we can't afford it. We're going to look at your financials. We're going to look at your cash flow on the property. One of the big things that we're going to look at is whether or not your rental income can cover that cost over the next 12 months. So if your income and rental income can cover it, it's likely you're going to probably end up paying for it. But this is, again, it's going to be very specific situations. So there's not, this isn't one of those places where I can say definitely if you can't afford it, you're not going to pay for it. No, it's going to be definitely very fact specific. Here's another question. If you have a pool and do not have a handicapped lift and a tenant asks for one and you are a TDHCA LIHTC property, do you have to pay for that? Probably, is the answer. Probably yes. Um, Especially if you were built after a certain time period, it probably should have been there in the first place. And it was probably something that was missed in the design and construction. Um, but yeah, that's going to be something you will most likely be required to pay for, if you are subject to Section 504.
And just jump in here real quick too. Just something random thought with that. Whether you, I mean, I know the majority of people listening right now are in the provider kind of sphere, but whether you are a provider or you are a tenant, and there is a modification, um, I mean, I or Nathan again. Not only can we get legal advice, but we can't steer you in certain directions. But I will say I do know that there are a lot of groups, advocacy groups, and stuff like that in the state of Texas who can help potentially offset cost for modifications in housing. So like I would always highly encourage that as well. I mean, because they do advocate for people with these disabilities, and so they may need something, and these advocacy groups might be able to help through their specific programs, maybe even offset that cost, whether you are a provider or a tenant. So it is something to look into as well. I just can't tell you and steer you into like, hey, go to these specific people because that'd be outside of my scope.
Yeah, that would be outside of my scope either. But you're absolutely right. There are organizations that may have funding available. Look around, especially local to you. There may be something. Would it be required a reasonable? Would it be considered reasonable for a tenant to require maintenance or vendors to wear hazmat suits when entering to fix work orders or to conduct inspections to help with allergies or fragrances or mental health issues? Okay, this sounds like a very specific question, and it's like maybe very specific to an actual thing that's going on with you. Let me and Jeff, I'm going to have you jump in on this one too. But if there are absolutely conditions where someone may actually require you to, um, be in some sort of protective equipment. Um, that specifically after major surgeries that where you may have a, like an organ transplant, like
Yeah, compromising. Yeah, I know what word you're
yes,
going for.
yes,
Immunocompromised. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Where that would absolutely be reasonable. It probably wouldn't be like a permanent one, but it would be like for probably for at least I would say several months would be definitely reasonable to require some sort of PPE. Whether or not that's like a full-on CDC hazmat suit, don't know. That's going to be very specific to the situation, and that's going to require a high level of documentation. Um, to get to that amount of PPE. Jeff, am I missing anything?
No, I mean, I go back trust verify. I mean, especially to the more exotic specific request does need to be documented. Where you may not, on the mental health disorder for the emotional support animal, you may not have to list the specific. I don't have to say that I have PTSD, that a mental health disorder is just naturally sufficient. But something where, but just saying in a letter where, maintenance or inspection staff have to, should be to limit exposure or something. I mean, that could just be somebody putting on one of the old face masks that they found from, their time back in 2020 and like, oh, let me throw this on because I'm covering my breath. And that might be good enough according to their interpretation of that letter. So the more specific requirements, somebody needing an N95 protective mask and little painter things, when you go view new homes, you have to put on those little booty things, might be requested, but for those type of requests, that documentation probably needs to spell out all of those things with, again, that nexus between all of those.
Yeah, that's really important. Remember, this is a situation where the disability is not readily apparent, which means the disability related need is not going to be readily apparent. Um, so you can request that documentation from a medical provider to see that that is necessary. The person did clarify that in this case there has not been any kind of surgery or anything like that. It's just based on a fear. I believe that theoretically, an extreme phobia could be considered a disability. I've never really seen it, but could come up with a I could certainly come up with that hypothetically in my head and not find it completely ridiculous or outlandish. Um, but again, that would need to be documented. If a tenant refuses a raised seat, are we required to change the toilet? Is there a disability related need for the specific toilet or for the raised seat, or is there a disability related need that the reason the seat would not work? Is the answer. So if a tenant requests a taller toilet and you say, hey, we have a raised seat that we could put in instead, and they say, no, I need it to be the toilet, you can certainly request documentation that shows that it's the toilet that is necessary and that the raised seat would not work. But in general, the person is not going, you're not going to be able to say, like, nope, no raised seat, no toilet. That's probably also not going to be a response that's plausible. Um, if they just don't like it, Jeff, this is going to be more on in your up your alley. If they just simply don't like the raised seat and want the toilet,
I mean, again, it comes down to, is there an accommodation that is working for the request? I, in my experience, again, because yeah, I mean, I just so everybody understands, I dual hat. Usually, a lot of times, in housing, somebody's coming up with that specific request, but then you get into, well, I can't, yeah, you need an elevator because you can't navigate the stairs. I can't install an elevator, so then we have that workaround. Is there something I can do to fix the situation? If somebody is need, needing a toilet, but we find the stool works or something else like that, then we're meeting the need of that accommodation or modification, specifically, and that's really what it comes down to. I mean, and again, it could move into that unreasonable request. Yeah, I don't have the because there's, and again, there could be a lot of ins and outs with this. I don't have the resources to buy a new toilet, install a new toilet, and when I can give you this thing that still fits potentially your need. And so, I mean, because ultimately, I mean, everybody should just be wanting to find that accommodation that works around that major life activity that is being um, substantially impaired. Now, a lot of times, I mean, again, and that's where that interactive process really comes into play, because again, I could see something online or on TikTok or on Google. Chat GPT could tell me this is exactly what I need, but it may not be in my provider's um, ability to do. And so both parties definitely need to have that, like, I'm coming into this to get the thing that works for me with my disability, not I'm only going to accept this.
Okay, well, I am not seeing any new questions coming in. If you still have questions, you come up with them like 10 minutes from now, or 30 minutes from now, or 2 weeks from now. Right, our contact information is up on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to us. We will definitely do our best to answer your question. And if we can't answer it, we'll try to find someone who can. And if you're asking us a legal question, uh, then we'll just tell you to find an attorney, because we can't do that. Do you have a list or an example of requests determined unreasonable? No, we do not have a list or examples of requests. We have some examples, Jeff, of things that are unreasonable, but
Right, but I
they're
mean,
not
what's
going to be.
unreasonable in San Antonio, that exact same request out in Menard could be acceptable. And
Yeah,
so,
here's a.
and again, I mean that it's case by case, it's tenant by tenant, it's location. I mean, that's why there is no one standard or even examples, because um, me managing a two-story apartment complex, if somebody is asking for that's got 12 units total and they're asking for an elevator, I don't have the overhead in, again, the city of Menard, if anybody even knows where that is. I may not have those kind of resources because, again, just the cost of living and everything out that way. But that same person in Corpus Christi might have those resources in the exact same situation. So that's where it is case by case, and even an example is hard because it may not fit your situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's funny is I can actually go ahead and give like a the example of literally the exact same requested a modification granted for one tenant and not granted for another tenant, even though the only thing that was different was the time. So they both had an equal disability, like both had a disability related need for a tub to shower conversion. And simply because the first person got that request in first, and they were able to afford it at that point, and their rental income could cover that. The addition of that second one doing that same thing meant that that would have put them over the amount where they could make up for it in a 12-month period. So it wasn't reasonable at that case. So literally the exact same thing could be reasonable in one case and unreasonable in another. So I don't know if there's a really useful list of examples um, that is informative on a general level. It would just be to that specific case. And they're all going to be fact specific. Okay. I think that is the end of our questions. So going to go ahead and wrap this up again. If you have questions later on, feel free to contact us. We'll get you your answer as soon as we can, or get you the person who can get you the answer um, as soon as we can. And join us next week for our assistance animals webinar, where we're going to go an hour and a half on everybody's favorite topic. Um, that one's going to be a little bit more. That one's going to be more question and answer. It's almost always about half question and answer and then half presentation. So it goes the whole time, but it's usually a little bit more free flowing. All right, and with that, thank you, Jeff, for joining us, and thank you everybody for participating today.
Thank you, everybody.